The Clark twins had always been a source of fascination in their Upper East Side neighborhood. Hannah and Olivia moved through life like mirror images, sharing not just their striking features, honey blonde hair, green eyes that changed color with their moods, and heart-shaped faces, but also the kind of connection that made others wonder if they could read each other's thoughts. Growing up, they finished each other's sentences, showed up wearing identical outfits without planning, and felt each other's pain, both emotional and physical. Their mother loved telling the story of how, when Hannah broke her arm falling from the treehouse at age 8, Olivia burst into tears at school at the exact same moment, clutching her own arm. The teachers called home, worried she'd been injured, only to discover the true source of her distress. These were the kinds of stories that made the twins feel special, different, chosen somehow. But as they grew older, that connection began to feel less like a gift and more like a curse. The first crack in their perfect unity appeared during their senior year of high school. Hannah got accepted to NYU, while Olivia received a full scholarship to Columbia. It was the first time they'd faced the prospect of separate lives, and neither handled it well. Hannah deferred her acceptance, taking a gap year she claimed was about finding herself, but really spent moping around their childhood home, waiting for Olivia to finish her freshman year so they could attend NYU together. That decision set a pattern. Hannah, the younger twin by 6 minutes, began shaping her life around Olivia's. She chose the same major, applied to the same internships, and even dated guys from the same fraternity. But life had other plans. Despite their identical resumes, Olivia seemed to catch all the breaks. She landed the prestigious marketing internship that turned into a job offer. She met Tom Harrison at a company party, tall, handsome Tom with his old money background and corner office at his family's investment firm. Hannah watched from the sidelines as Olivia's life bloomed like a flower in spring, while her own withered. She took a job at a smaller firm, dated guys who couldn't compare to Tom, and lived in a cramped studio apartment in Queens while Olivia moved into Tom's penthouse on Park Avenue. The disparity in their lives grew impossible to ignore, breeding resentment that festered beneath their still sweet sister act. Then came the day Olivia showed up at Hannah's apartment, mascara streaking her cheeks, marriage weighing heavy on her shoulders. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, collapsing onto Hannah's worn futon. "The parties, the expectations, the perfect wife act, it's suffocating me." Hannah held her sister, stroked her hair, and listened as Olivia poured out her heart. But beneath her sympathetic murmurs, a plan began taking shape in her mind. "What if we switched places?" Hannah suggested, trying to keep her voice casual. "Just for a while. You could take a break, clear your head, and I could." She let the sentence hang there, not wanting to reveal too much of her desperation. Olivia lifted her head, eyes brightening with interest. "You'd do that for me?" The question carried a hint of suspicion, but desperation won out. They spent the next hours plotting, going over details only twins would think to consider. How Olivia held her coffee cup with both hands while Hannah used just right. How Tom liked his eggs in the morning. The names of the doorman's kids. The switch happened on a Tuesday. Hannah walked into Tom's penthouse, wearing her sister's designer clothes, while Olivia caught a flight to Miami using Hannah's ID. It was meant to be temporary, a few weeks at most. But as Hannah settled into Olivia's life, she discovered something intoxicating about wearing the mask of the perfect wife. She learned to navigate Tom's world with careful observation and quick thinking. When she didn't remember names or details, she blamed stress or too much wine. She studied Olivia's social media posts, mimicking her sister's mannerisms and preferences. But she also began making subtle changes, ones she thought improved upon Olivia's role. Tom noticed the differences, but didn't seem to mind. "You seem more relaxed lately," he told her over dinner one evening, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. Hannah's heart fluttered at the touch. She hadn't planned on falling for her sister's husband, but Tom's attention felt like validation of everything she'd ever wanted. The weeks stretched into months. Olivia's check-in calls became less frequent, her voice distant when they did talk. Hannah barely noticed, too caught up in her new reality. She started moving money from Tom's accounts into one she'd set up in Hannah's name, just a safety net, she told herself. But deep down, She knew she was preparing for something bigger. The facade began cracking when Tom found old photos while cleaning out their home office. "Since when do you bite your nails?" he asked, showing her a picture from their honeymoon. Hannah's hands, hidden beneath the table, showed chewed-down nails, a habit Olivia had never shared. "And your signature looks different on these recent documents." The questions multiplied. Tom started watching her more closely, making unexpected appearances at lunch dates, quizzing her about their past. Hannah felt the perfect life she'd built starting to crumble. When Olivia finally called to say she was ready to switch back, Hannah knew she had to act fast. But she never imagined her desperate grab for happiness would end in a hotel room with blood on her hands and sirens in the distance.
"We all wear masks sometimes."
A brave face for a difficult meeting, a smile at a party we'd rather not attend, a confident stride when we're shaking inside. But how many of us truly know the faces behind the masks of those closest to us? The question haunted Tom Harrison long after the truth about the twins came to light. In the months following the incident, reporters would ask him how he had known, how he couldn't tell the difference between his wife and her sister. The questions burned like acid, forcing him to re-examine every moment, every conversation, every kiss. Had there been signs he missed? Little tells that should have given away the deception? The doorman at their building later told police he'd noticed small changes. How Mrs. Harrison suddenly started taking her coffee black instead of with cream. How she'd begun using her left hand to sign for packages. But he'd chalked it up to people changing habits, the way we all do over time. The housekeeper mentioned that Mrs. Harrison's organization system had shifted, her usual meticulous color coding replaced by a different, but equally precise method. Even their regular waitress at Le Bernardin had picked up on subtle differences, new food preferences, a slightly different laugh. They'd all noticed something, but none of them had suspected the truth. Because who would? Who looks at their spouse, their neighbor, their client, and thinks, maybe this isn't really them at all? We trust our eyes, our hearts, our memories. We believe in the fundamental constants of our lives, that the person we wake up next to is the same one we fell asleep beside. The case became a sensation, sparking conversations across dinner tables and social media. People shared their own stories of deception, of twins switching places in school, of siblings covering for each other during dates. But none quite matched the scope of the Clark sisters' deception, or its tragic end. Psychologists weighed in on morning shows, discussing the unique bond between twins and the blurred lines of identity that can exist between them. Social media exploded with theories and opinions. Everyone had a take. Everyone saw themselves in some aspect of the story: the deceived husband, the trapped wife, the envious sister. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of these interpretations. It wasn't just about twins switching places or a marriage gone wrong. It was about identity, how we see ourselves, how others see us, and the gaps that exist between those perceptions. It was about the stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions, and the lies we believe because the truth is too painful to face. In the end, everyone involved had been living a double life of sorts. Olivia, pretending to be the perfect wife while suffocating under the weight of expectations. Hannah, wearing her sister's life like a borrowed dress, hoping no one would notice the loose threads. Even Tom, playing the role of the successful businessman while his personal life unraveled beneath the surface. The question wasn't just whether we could tell if someone we loved was living a double life, it was whether we could even recognize when we were living one ourselves. As Hannah would later write from her prison cell, sometimes the person we're really fooling is ourselves. The story of the Clark twins became more than just another true crime sensation. It became a mirror, reflecting back our own capacity for deception and self-delusion. And as the tragedy unfolded in that hotel room, it would force everyone involved to finally face their true reflections, no matter how painful the sight. Hannah's transformation into Olivia happened so gradually that sometimes she forgot she was playing a role. She mastered her sister's signature, learned to love green juice instead of coffee, and even picked up Olivia's habit of sleeping on the left side of the bed. But perfection had its price, and the cracks in her performance started showing up in unexpected ways. The first major slip happened during a dinner party with Tom's colleagues. Someone mentioned a trip to Bali that Olivia and Tom had taken the previous year, asking about a specific temple they'd visited. Hannah, caught off guard, fumbled through a vague response about it being so spiritual and really beautiful. She could feel Tom's eyes on her, noting how she'd forgotten the name of the temple she'd supposedly meditated in for hours. Later that night, Tom casually mentioned how strange it was that she couldn't remember the place she'd called life-changing in their photos. Hannah blamed it on too much wine, but she caught him watching her more closely after that. She started finding him in their home office late at night, going through old photos and documents, his face twisted in concentration. The pressure of maintaining the charade began wearing on her. She started making small mistakes, calling Tom's mother by the wrong name, forgetting which yoga studio she supposedly frequented, mixing up details about their wedding day. Each slip felt like a tiny crack in a dam, threatening to burst at any moment. Money became another issue. Hannah had always been careful with the transfers, moving small amounts from their joint accounts to her separate one, nothing that would raise immediate red flags. But Tom, it turned out, paid more attention to their finances than Olivia had led her to believe. One morning, over breakfast, he casually mentioned some unusual transactions he'd noticed. "I didn't know you were interested in cryptocurrency," he said, sliding his tablet across the table to show her the transfers. Hannah's heart raced as she saw the transactions listed there, not just the ones she'd made, but earlier ones she hadn't known about. Olivia had been moving money too, long before their switch. Meanwhile, Olivia's vacation had taken an unexpected turn. What started as a few weeks in Miami turned into months of drifting between cities, using Hannah's identity to stay under the radar. She sent occasional texts to Hannah, but their conversations grew shorter, tenser. Something in her sister's messages felt off, but Hannah was too caught up in her own deception to notice the warning signs. Olivia had discovered something during her time away, a freedom she'd never known she wanted. Living as Hannah meant no expectations, no social obligations, no perfect wife persona to maintain. She took odd jobs, made new friends, even had a brief romance with a bartender in Key West. But as weeks turned into months, she began to realize that Hannah wasn't just borrowing her life, she was taking it over. The final straw came when Olivia checked their joint account and found it nearly empty. The money she'd been secretly moving for years, preparing for a chance at escape, was gone. Hannah had found her safety net and dismantled it piece by piece. Rage and betrayal drove Olivia back to New York, no longer content to watch her life slip away from a distance. Tom's suspicions reached a breaking point around the same time. He hired a private investigator who uncovered Hannah's separate account and the regular transfers. But the PI found something else too, evidence that both sisters had been planning something long before the switch. Hidden accounts, secret meetings, a paper trail that suggested years of financial manipulation. When Tom confronted Olivia about the money, Hannah tried to talk her way out of it. She spun a story about investment opportunities and surprise renovations, but she could see in his eyes that he wasn't buying it anymore. The perfect husband she'd fallen for showed a darker side that day, his voice cold as he laid out every inconsistency he'd noticed over the past months. Olivia chose that moment to resurface, showing up at their apartment unannounced. The doorman, confused by the sight of Mrs. Harrison coming home when she was supposedly already upstairs, called Tom immediately. The careful plan the sisters had built began collapsing like a house of cards, leading them all toward that fateful night in the hotel room where their deceptions would finally catch up with them. Olivia hadn't planned on telling Tom everything. She'd meant to confront Hannah first, to understand why her sister had betrayed her trust. But seeing Tom in their apartment that day, his face hard with suspicion and anger, the truth spilled out like water from a broken dam. She told him about the switch, about their childhood games of trading places, about how this last swap had spiraled out of control. Tom sat in silence as Olivia talked, his hands clenched around a glass of scotch. The sun set outside their penthouse windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. When Olivia finally stopped talking, the silence stretched between them like a physical thing. "How long have you been back?" he asked finally, his voice unnaturally calm. 3 days, Olivia admitted. I've been staying at the Wellington Hotel. I needed time to figure out how to handle this. Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. Handle this? Like it's a PR crisis? He stood up, pacing the room. Do you have any idea what this means? The money that's missing, the documents Hannah signed in your name, the business deals she's been involved in. This isn't just about your little identity game anymore. Olivia felt sick. She'd known Hannah had been accessing their accounts, but she hadn't realized how deep the deception went. I can fix this, she said, reaching for Tom's arm. He jerked away from her touch. Fix it? The board meeting last month. That wasn't you. The Miller contract, the Weston deal. That was all Hannah? Playing house is one thing, but she's been making million-dollar decisions in your name. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Olivia's heart ache. And you're just as guilty. Planning this for years, moving money around behind my back. Were you ever going to tell me you were unhappy? The plan came together over bitter coffee in Tom's office the next morning. They would meet Hannah at the Wellington Hotel, neutral ground. Tom would bring the financial records, laying out exactly what he knew. Olivia would confront her sister about the betrayal. They'd find a way to untangle the legal mess without involving the authorities, if Hannah cooperated. What they didn't plan for was Hannah's reaction. She arrived at the hotel room looking perfectly put together in Olivia's favorite blue dress, her hair styled the way Olivia used to wear it. The sight made Olivia's stomach turn. Well, isn't this cozy? Hannah said, closing the door behind her. Family reunion? Tom stood by the window, his lawyer on speakerphone. The papers spread across the room's desk told a story of systematic deception, accounts drained, contracts signed, deals made under false pretenses. But Hannah barely glanced at them. You were never supposed to really be me, Olivia said, her voice shaking. This was supposed to be temporary. A break, that's all I needed. But you took everything. Hannah's laugh was sharp enough to cut. Took everything? You had everything. The perfect life, the perfect husband, the perfect escape plan with all that money you'd been squirreling away. Did you think I wouldn't find out about that? Your little secret account that you'd been building for years. Tom's head snapped up at this, his eyes moving between the sisters. The lawyer's voice crackled through the phone, advising everyone to stay calm, but nobody was listening anymore. I needed that money, Olivia said. You don't understand what it's like, always being the perfect one, always having to meet everyone's expectations. I was suffocating. No, you don't understand. Hannah shouted, her carefully constructed facade cracking. You got everything handed to you. The jobs, the opportunities, the perfect life. And what did I get? To be the backup, Olivia? The spare. The tension in the room built like a thunderstorm. Tom moved between them, trying to restore order, but the sisters were beyond hearing. Years of resentment and buried feelings erupted all at once. When Hannah shoved Olivia, sending her stumbling backward, Tom reacted instinctively. He grabbed the heavy crystal vase from the desk, meaning only to get Hannah's attention. But in the chaos and confusion, with two identical faces turned toward him in fear, he made a mistake that would haunt him forever. The vase connected with Olivia's temple instead of Hannah's, and the sound it made would echo in their nightmares for years to come. Time seemed to stop in that hotel room. The sound of breaking glass still hung in the air as Olivia crumpled to the floor, her body moving in slow motion like a dancer taking her final bow. Hannah couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was seeing. Her sister's blood spread across the beige carpet in a pattern that looked almost beautiful, like spilled wine at one of Tom's dinner parties. Tom dropped the vase, pieces of crystal scattering across the floor like diamonds. Oh God, he kept saying. Oh God, oh God. His hands shook as he reached for Olivia's neck, checking for a pulse that wasn't there. I thought she was you. I thought. Hannah, I swear I thought she was you. Hannah's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees beside her sister. Their matching blonde hair mixed together on the carpet, and for a moment, she couldn't tell which strands belonged to whom. It seemed fitting. They'd spent their whole lives tangled up in each other's identities, and now here they were, tangled up in death. The room felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. Tom was pacing, running his hands through his hair, leaving streaks of red that he didn't seem to notice. "We need to call someone," he said, his voice cracking. "An ambulance. The police. Someone." Hannah reached for her sister's hand, still warm but growing cooler by the second. She remembered holding this same hand on their first day of kindergarten, both of them scared but brave because they had each other. She remembered painting each other's nails before prom, planning their futures between coats of pink polish. She remembered the last time they'd switched places as kids, fooling their parents at dinner until they both started giggling and gave themselves away. "This is my fault," she whispered, but the words felt inadequate. How could any words capture the weight of what she'd done? Her greed, her jealousy, her desperate need to be special had led them here. She'd wanted Olivia's life so badly, she'd never stopped to think about what it might cost. The sound of sirens grew louder outside the hotel window. Tom had made the call, his voice steady even as tears ran down his face. He'd given them the room number, told them there had been an accident. An accident, such a simple word for something that would destroy so many lives. Hannah looked at her reflection in the mirror above the hotel desk. She was still wearing Olivia's dress, still had her hair styled the way Olivia wore it. For a moment, she considered running. She could walk out of the hotel as Olivia, disappear into the night, let Tom take the blame. Who would know? She was the perfect copy, the backup Olivia. Wasn't that what she'd always been? But as she caught her own eyes in the mirror, she saw Olivia staring back at her. Not the perfect wife Olivia had pretended to be, but the real Olivia, her sister, her best friend, her other half. The Olivia who had climbed into her bed during thunderstorms, who had held her hand through their first heartbreaks, who had trusted her enough to suggest this crazy scheme in the first place. The door burst open and police officers flooded the room, their voices sharp with authority. Tom raised his hands immediately, still mumbling about accidents and mistakes. Hannah stayed on her knees beside her sister, her confession building in her throat like a wave about to break. "I need to tell you something," she said to the first officer who approached her. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. She told them everything: the switch, the scheme, the money, the fights. She told them about growing up in Olivia's shadow, about wanting what her sister had, about how it had all spun so horribly out of control. The officers exchanged glances as she talked, probably wondering if she was in shock or just crazy. But Hannah kept going, her voice growing stronger with each word. She owed Olivia this much at least, the truth, finally, after so many lies. As they led her away from her sister's body, Hannah caught one final glimpse in the mirror. For the first time in months, she recognized the person staring back at her. The confession room at the police station felt smaller than Hannah's prison cell would later be. Detective Sarah Chin sat across from her, recording device between them, as Hannah pieced together the story that would destroy what remained of her life. Her hands shook as she accepted a paper cup of water, leaving fingerprints that smudged her sister's perfect manicure. "Start from the beginning," Detective Chin said, her voice gentler than Hannah expected. "Tell me about the switch." Hannah closed her eyes, remembering that day in her cramped apartment. "Olivia came to me crying. She said she needed a break from her life, from being perfect all the time. But that wasn't the whole truth. She'd been planning to leave for months, maybe years. Moving money, setting up accounts. I found out later, she had a whole escape plan ready." The detective's pen scratched against her notepad. "And whose idea was it to switch places?" "I suggested it," Hannah admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. But Olivia jumped at the chance. I think we both wanted to escape ourselves for different reasons. She wanted freedom from expectations. I wanted." She trailed off, staring at her hands. "What did you want, Hannah?" "Everything," she whispered. "I wanted her life, her husband, her success. I wanted to know what it felt like to be the better twin for once." The investigation revealed layers of deception neither sister had fully understood. Olivia's secret accounts contained more money than Hannah had realized. Email records showed she'd been in contact with a man in Miami months before the switch. Tom's business dealings weren't as clean as they appeared either. The pressure he'd been under hadn't just come from his suspicions about his wife. Hannah's cooperation changed everything. She provided passwords to accounts, turned over documents, explained every transaction and decision she'd made while playing Olivia. The prosecutor's office was building a case against Tom, but they needed Hannah's testimony to make it stick. In her cell at night, Hannah started writing letters to Olivia. She knew they'd never be read, but something about putting words on paper helped her make sense of things. She wrote about their childhood, about the first time they switched places in 3rd grade, about the moment she realized she'd fallen in love with Tom. She wrote apologies until her hand cramped and the words blurred together. "Dear Olivia," one letter began, "today I told them about the money. All of it, yours and mine. The detective asked me why I didn't just ask you for help if I was struggling. I didn't know how to explain that asking for help meant admitting you were better than me. That sounds so stupid now. We could have helped each other instead of tearing each other apart." The hardest part was facing their parents. Their mother couldn't look at her during the prison visit, but their father held her hand across the table as she cried. "You two are always so competitive," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even as babies, fighting to see who could walk first, talk first. We thought it was cute. We should have seen where it was leading." Hannah's testimony at Tom's preliminary hearing was devastating. She described his growing suspicions, his angry confrontations, the way he'd grabbed the vase with purpose, not panic. The security cameras from the hotel corridor showed him pacing for 10 minutes before calling 911. His lawyer tried to paint it as shock, but Hannah's description of his calculated behavior in the weeks leading up to that night told a different story. The truth, when it finally came out, wasn't simple. Everyone had played a part in the tragedy. Olivia with her secret escape plans, Hannah with her desperate grab for a life that wasn't hers, Tom with his need for control. The prosecutor called it a perfect storm of deception. The media called it the tale of two Olivias. Hannah just called it what it was: the day she lost the other half of herself. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters the morning of Tom's trial. Hannah wore a plain black dress that belonged to neither sister, her hair its natural dirty blonde instead of Olivia's preferred honey highlights. As she walked past the cameras, someone shouted, "Which twin are you?" The question hit her like a slap. Inside the courtroom, Tom sat at the defense table looking smaller than she remembered. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame, his face gaunt from months in custody. When their eyes met, Hannah felt an echo of the attraction that had helped lead them here, but it was distant now, like a song heard from another room. The prosecution's opening statement painted a picture of calculated violence. They talked about Tom's controlling nature, his financial irregularities, his growing paranoia as he realized his wife wasn't who she seemed to be. "This isn't a story about mistaken identity," the prosecutor said. "This is a story about a man who saw his control slipping away and chose violence to regain it." Tom's defense team argued temporary insanity, claiming the twins' deception had pushed him past his breaking point. They brought in psychologists who talked about the mental strain of discovering such an elaborate betrayal. They showed photos of Tom and Olivia in happier times, contrasted with bank statements showing the missing money. "My client was the victim of an elaborate fraud," Tom's lawyer argued. His wife and her sister conspired to steal from him, to deceive him in the most intimate ways possible. When faced with this betrayal, he suffered a momentary break from reality. Hannah sat through it all, watching the story of their lives turned into legal arguments and evidence exhibits. The hotel room photos were the worst, seeing Olivia's body reduced to crime scene markers and blood spatter analysis made her physically ill. When Hannah finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She felt the weight of every eye on her as she swore to tell the truth, something that seemed ironic given how long she'd lived a lie. The prosecutor led her through the events methodically, building the case piece by piece. "Did Mr. Harrison ever express violent tendencies before that night?" the prosecutor asked. Hannah gripped the edges of the witness stand. "He was always very controlled, very careful about his image. But there were moments. When he thought I was Olivia, he'd sometimes grab my arm too hard during arguments or throw things in his office when deals went wrong. The night before everything happened, he told me he'd make me regret it if I was lying to him. Tom's lawyer tried to paint Hannah as the real villain during cross-examination. Isn't it true that you seduced your sister's husband while pretending to be her? That you stole not just her identity, but her entire life? Yes, Hannah admitted, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. I wanted her life. I wanted everything she had. I'm not trying to pretend I'm innocent in all this. But Tom knew something was wrong for weeks. He chose to deal with it with violence instead of going to the police. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Evidence mounted. The hotel security footage showing Tom's delayed call for help, his internet searches about undetectable poisons in the weeks before, emails to a private investigator discussing ways to deal with the situation. The prosecution's case grew stronger by the day. When the jury delivered their verdict, Hannah held her breath. Tom stood, still looking more like a businessman than a defendant, as the foreman read out, guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. The recommended 20-year sentence felt both too long and not long enough. After the verdict, Hannah faced her own legal consequences. Her fraud charges seemed minor compared to Tom's crime, but they represented the choices that had led them all here. As she stood before the judge for sentencing, she finally understood something Olivia had tried to tell her years ago. Sometimes running away from yourself only leads you right back to where you started, but with more scars than before. 5 years passed like a slow breath in prison. Hannah marked time by the letters she wrote to Olivia, one every day, stored in a box under her bed since they could never be sent. The other inmates called her twin at first, but as her hair grew out dark at the roots and her designer clothes were replaced by prison blues, she slowly became just Hannah. Her cell had a small window that faced east, and every morning she watched the sun rise and thought about Olivia. They'd shared a room until college, their beds positioned so they could both see the sunrise. Now Hannah watched alone, trying to make sense of the path that had led her here. The letters became her therapy, her confession, her way of holding onto the sister she'd lost. Dear Olivia, she wrote one night, today I finally admitted to myself that I never really wanted to be you. I wanted to be seen the way people saw you, special, successful, loved. But you felt just as trapped as I did, didn't you? We were both pretending to be versions of ourselves that didn't really exist. Her parents visited monthly, bringing news from the outside world. Tom's appeal had been denied. He'd been moved to a medium-security prison upstate. The money, both what Hannah had taken and what Olivia had hidden away, had been recovered and returned to the estate. Their childhood home had been sold, their mother unable to live with the memories it held. Prison counseling helped Hannah understand the tangled roots of her actions. She built her identity around being Olivia's twin, measuring herself against her sister until she couldn't see herself as anything else. The counselor helped her explore who she was without that mirror, just Hannah, not a twin, not a copy, not a spare. When Hannah was released, the world had moved on. The media circus had found new stories to chase, and she walked out of prison on a quiet Tuesday morning with no cameras in sight. Her father picked her up in his old Toyota, and they drove home in comfortable silence. She found purpose in unexpected places. A support group for families affected by identity theft invited her to speak, and she found herself sharing her story, not the sensationalized version from the media, but the raw truth about identity, jealousy, and the dangerous allure of becoming someone else. The speaking engagements led to counseling work. Hannah went back to school, earned her degree in psychology, and started working with twins and siblings dealing with identity issues. She never sugarcoated her story or tried to paint herself as a victim. Instead, she used it as a warning, a map of all the wrong turns that could lead someone down the same dark path. Her mother finally came to one of her talks, sitting in the back row with tears running down her face. Afterwards, they went for coffee, and for the first time since Olivia's death, they really talked. She loved you, her mother said, holding Hannah's hand across the table. Even when you were both lost, she loved you. 10 years after the tragedy, Hannah visited Olivia's grave on their birthday. She brought 2 cupcakes, chocolate with vanilla frosting, their childhood favorite. She sat on the grass and read her last letter aloud, the pages worn from many revisions. Dear Olivia, she read, her voice steady in the morning air. I finally understand what you were trying to tell me all those years ago. Success isn't about being the best or having the perfect life. It's about being true to yourself. I'm sorry it took losing you to learn that. I'm sorry for all the times I tried to be you instead of being myself. I'm learning now, finally, how to just be Hannah. And I think you'd be proud of who I'm becoming. She left one cupcake on the grave and ate the other, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. For the first time in years, she felt whole, not as half of a matching set, but as herself, finally embracing the person she was meant to be all along.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.